December 19th. The Italian front was not the sun, drenched vineyards or ancient Roman boulevards that many Allied soldiers had imagined when they first landed. It was a nightmare of mud, bone, chilling rain, and rushing rivers that blocked the path north. Along the Adriatic coast, the British Eighth Army was struggling to pierce the German winter line to advance on Rome. But blocking that vital artery was a small ancient port town with narrow cobbled streets and houses built shoulder to shoulder, Ortona. In world military history, the name Ortona is often overshadowed by larger battles like Monte Cassino or Normandy, which followed. But for the soldiers who set foot there in Christmas of 1943, Ortona was synonymous with hell. The international press at the time branded the place with a haunting nickname, Little Stalingrad. This comparison was no exaggeration. The sheer brutality, the total destruction of infrastructure, and the nature of the fighting, scrapping for every room, every staircase, bore an uncanny resemblance to the bloodiest battle on the Eastern Front. What makes Ortona a case study in human extraordinary capability lies in the identity of the opposing forces. On the defensive side, Hitler did not send ordinary infantry. He placed there the jewel in the crown of the Wehrmacht, the 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjager. These were the Green Devils. Hardened veterans who had dropped into Crete, fought through the Russian winter, and been forged in the fires of the war's fiercest conflicts. They were the definition of elite, equipped with the best automatic weaponry and possessing an iron discipline. Their mission was simple: hold Ortona at all costs. Facing off against Europe's premier fighting force were not the U.S. Marines, nor were they the proud British Guards units. The burden of breaking Ortona was placed on the shoulders of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. This is a historical fact, often overlooked in the grand panorama of the Second World War. The Canadian Army is frequently viewed as a supporting force, standing in the shadow of the British and American giants. But at Ortona, they were the sole protagonists. The contrast becomes even more stark when looking at the background of these Canadian soldiers. They were called farm boys. This was not a put-down term, but an accurate description of their origins. The men of the loyal Edmonton Regiment, or the Seaforth Highlanders, came mostly from the vastness of Western Canada. Before putting on their khaki uniforms, their hands were used to steering tractors across the endless wheat fields of Alberta, swinging hammers in Saskatchewan, or working the timber mills of British Columbia. They were volunteers, civilians who had left peaceful lives to join a war across the ocean. They grew up in lands where the view stretched to the horizon, where open space was a way of life. They had never been properly trained to fight in a cramped, suffocating urban environment where visibility was limited to the brick wall in front of their faces. No one had taught them how to storm a 3-story house or how to deal with a sniper hiding behind a church chimney. By military theory, sending boys used to the open prairies into a deadly urban maze to face the world's most battle. Hardened paratroopers was a recipe for disaster. But history did not follow that theory. At Ortona, reality shattered the myth of the German paratroopers' invincibility. These Canadian farm boys, through natural grit and astounding adaptability, rewrote the textbook on urban warfare right in the midst of the crossfire. They didn't just fight. They invented a new way of fighting. The story of Ortona is not just a story of guns and ammunition. It is the story of how a group of dedicated amateurs defeated the world's leading military experts on the enemy's own turf. And to understand that miracle, we must first understand why the Germans were so certain that victory was already theirs. To understand the sheer scale of the danger facing the Canadian troops, we must view the enemy through the lens of the Germans themselves. In December 1943, the 1st Parachute Division was not merely a military unit. They were a living legend, under the command of General Richard Heydrich, a stern-faced and ruthless leader. This division was known as Hitler's Firemen. Wherever the front line was collapsing, they were thrown in to patch the breach with blood and iron discipline. These paratroopers called themselves Althesen. Hold Harris, a German slang term for the most seasoned veterans, men who had survived every hell on earth. They had executed the daring airborne invasion of Crete in 1941. They had fought in the -40-degree freeze of Leningrad. They had stalled the Allies in Sicily. In their eyes, the Canadians were merely amateurs, farm boys who were still green. This arrogance was not unfounded. The German paratroopers believed that battlefield experience would always triumph over youthful enthusiasm. Furthermore, the Germans did not rely solely on individual skill. They had transformed Ortona into a technically perfect death trap. Before the 1st Canadian tank rolled into the outskirts of the town, German combat engineers had spent weeks shaping the battlefield. They did not just occupy the houses. They fortified them into a network of bunkers. Realizing the streets of Ortona were narrow, the Germans used a brutal tactic. They deliberately demolished corner buildings with heavy explosives. This was not random destruction. The massive piles of rubble that spilled into the streets formed obstacles that were impassable for Canadian Sherman tanks. This immediately stripped away the attackers' greatest advantage: armored support. If the Canadians wanted to advance, they would be forced to leave the protection of their tanks and walk. And that was exactly when the trap would snap shut. The Germans had calculated every square meter of the kill zones. They sowed Teller anti-tank mines and S-mines, the bounding mines that jumped to waist height before exploding, feared by Allied troops as bouncing Bettys. Hidden amongst the debris, they positioned MG-42 machine guns, with a rate of fire of 200 rounds per minute, sounding like ripping canvas, in interlocking fields of fire. This ensured that anyone stepping over the rubble would be cut down from at least 2 directions at the same time. Crucially, the German paratroopers displayed cunning in their sniper placement. They did not hide on rooftops or in bell towers as often seen in films, for those were easy targets for artillery. Instead, they hid deep inside the darkened rooms of the 1st or 2nd floors, firing through tiny loopholes chipped into the walls. They waited patiently, allowing the lead Canadian section to pass, only to open fire on the men following behind, or specifically targeting officers and radio operators. This tactic sowed absolute panic. General Heydrich and his officers were certain that Ortona would be the graveyard of the 1st Canadian Division. They held the high ground. They possessed the experience, and they had prepared every brick. By German calculations, the Canadians, used to open warfare on the plains, would be crushed the moment they stepped into this tight maze. They believed the farm boys would soon lose their nerve when they saw their comrades falling without knowing where the bullet came from. But there was one variable the Germans had failed to account for in their equation for victory. The sheer bloody minded stubbornness of the Canadian soldier, and their ability to learn at lightning speed when backed into a corner. Germany had prepared for a battle according to the old textbook. Canada was about to write a new one. So, who were the men tasked with cracking this nut? Who were the soldiers walking into the crosshairs of the world's most dangerous snipers? To answer that, we must look at the shoulder patches they wore. Leading the assault were 2 infantry battalions that would become legendary in Canadian military history. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment, known affectionately as the Loyal Eddies, and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. Supporting them with armor was the Three Rivers Regiment from Quebec, when the German propaganda machine dismissed them as farm boys. They were ironically telling the truth. The Loyal Edmontons were drawn largely from Alberta, a land of vast wheat fields and cowboy country. The Seaforths came from British Columbia, a province of massive mountains and dense forests. These were not career soldiers. In their civilian lives, they were lumberjacks who felled giant cedars, miners who worked deep underground, railway gangs who laid tracks across freezing tundra, and farmers who worked from dawn till dusk. They were mechanics, carpenters, and truck drivers. Crucially, every single one of them was a volunteer. Unlike other nations at the time, Canada had not yet sent conscripts overseas. These men had chosen to be there. They had walked away from the safety of the prairies and the Rockies to fight a war thousands of miles from home. This volunteer spirit created a unique bond. They weren't just a military unit. They were a brotherhood of neighbors, cousins, and high school friends. However, their background presented a terrifying problem. They were men of the great outdoors. Their training in the rolling countryside of England had prepared them for open warfare, maneuvering through fields, advancing behind artillery barrages in open spaces. They had received virtually no training in urban warfare. The concept of fighting room to room was alien to them. But their background also gave them a hidden advantage that the German High Command had severely underestimated. A life spent battling the harsh Canadian elements had forged a specific kind of toughness. They were used to freezing winters. They were used to hard labor. And most importantly, as men from the frontier, they were natural tinkerers and problem solvers. If a tractor broke down in the middle of a harvest, you didn't wait for an engineer. You fixed it yourself with whatever you had. They possessed a quiet, stoic toughness. They didn't have the fanfare of the Americans or the rigid class structure of the British. They simply approached the war like a difficult job that needed finishing so they could go home. As they stood on the outskirts of Ortona, staring at the shattered skyline, they were about to need every ounce of that cleverness. The farm boys were about to enter a meat grinder that would chew up regular tactics in a matter of hours. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to become the most lethal urban warriors on the Italian front. As the Loyal Edmontons and the Seaforths advanced into the town proper, the war changed instantly. The open skies of the Italian countryside vanished, replaced by a claustrophobic gray ceiling of smoke and dust. The world narrowed down to the width of a street, then the width of a doorway, and finally the width of a knife blade. This was the moment Ortona earned its grim title. Little Stalingrad. The fighting did not happen over miles or kilometers. It happened in meters and inches. The geography of the town worked entirely against the Canadians. The main street, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, led straight into the town center. But the Germans had turned it into a bowling alley of death. Machine gun nests and anti-tank guns were positioned straight down the long axis of the street. To step onto the pavement was suicide. Forced off the main streets, the Canadians tried to clear the buildings house by house. But here they discovered the true depth of the German defensive genius. The paratroopers had not just fortified individual houses. They had created a vertical battlefield. Combat became a three-dimensional nightmare. A Canadian platoon might clear the ground floor of a house, only to be attacked by Germans firing through holes in the ceiling from the floor above. As the Canadians fought their way up the stairs, often tossing grenades around corners before rushing, the Germans would retreat to the roof and cross planks to the next building, leaving behind booby traps that would explode when the Canadians secured the room. The closeness of the violence was horrifying. In the open field, you might shoot at a gray shape 300 yards away. In Ortona, men were killing each other at point, blank range in kitchens and bedrooms. They fought amidst the shattered remnants of civilian life, a child's doll covered in plaster dust, a family portrait hanging crookedly on a wall. The noise was deafening. In the confined stone streets, the sound of explosions couldn't escape. The blast of a grenade explosion in a small room would rupture eardrums and cause internal bleeding, even if the shrapnel missed you. The air was thick with the sharp smell of cordite, rotting food, and unburied bodies, creating a choking fog that clung to their uniforms. But the most scary threat was the silence between the explosions. The German snipers were masters of patience. They did not shoot at everything that moved. They waited for the important targets. A Canadian officer might peek around a corner for a split second to check his men, and that was all it took. The sniper fire was so intense that movement became impossible. Men would lie pinned down behind a pile of rubble for hours, unable to move, listening to the groans of wounded comrades they couldn't reach. The standard infantry tactics the Canadians had learned in England, fire and maneuver, were useless here. You couldn't flank a machine gun nest when the flank was a solid stone wall rigged with explosives. You couldn't call in heavy artillery support without risking burying your own men who were fighting in the house next door. By the second day of fighting inside the town, the casualty rates were skyrocketing. The farm boys were bleeding out on the cold stone floors of Italian villas. It became clear to every soldier on the ground. If they continued to fight this way, entering through the front door and fighting up the stairs, they would all die. They were playing the game exactly how the Germans wanted them to play it. To survive, they had to stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like burglars and demolition experts. They had to reject the street entirely. Faced with the prospect of being wiped out, the Canadians did something remarkable. They threw away the military rule book. Captain Bill Longhurst of the loyal Edmonton Regiment looked at the row of terrace houses where walls were shared between buildings and realized that the street was the enemy. If the Germans wanted the street, they could have it. The Canadians were going to stay inside. Thus was born the tactic that would define the Battle of Ortona, mouse holing. The concept was brutally simple, yet clever in its use. Instead of leaving a captured house to attack the next one via the front door or the street, the Canadians would blast a hole through the connecting walls on the top floor. They would tunnel through the town from attic to attic without ever exposing themselves to the sniper fire outside. Here is how the farm boys did this lethal choreography. Two men would sprint to the top floor of a secured building, using a beehive charge, a cone-shaped explosive designed to direct force inward, or simply packing plastic explosives against the wall. They would blow a hole large enough for a man to crouch through. The explosion would fill the room with choking dust and debris. This was the critical moment. While the air was still thick with white powder, a Canadian soldier would hurl a grenade through the new jagged opening. Following the blast, another soldier would stick the barrel of his Sten gun or Bren gun through the hole, spraying the room blindly to stop any survivors. Only then would they climb through the gap, stepping over the rubble to clear the room with bayonets and knives. Once the house was cleared, they would reload, move to the far wall, and do it all over again. This tactic completely destroyed the German defensive strategy. The paratroopers were waiting with their MG-42s trained on the doorways and windows. They had mined the staircases. But suddenly, the Canadians were bursting out of the living room walls, bypassing the traps entirely. The kill zones on the street became meaningless because the Canadians weren't on the street. The Canadians also improvised their heavy weaponry. The PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, was designed to destroy tanks, but in the tight spaces of Ortona, the Canadians discovered it was an excellent bunker buster. They used it to blast snipers out of windows across the street. Even the anti-tank crews joined the fight. The 6-pounder anti-tank guns were dragged over piles of rubble and used at point-blank range to bring down entire walls where Germans were hiding. The mouse-holing technique turned the battle into a terrifying game of cat and mouse. But the roles had reversed. The elite German paratroopers, confused and disoriented, found themselves constantly outflanked within their own strongholds. They could hear the muffled thump of explosions getting closer, wall by wall, knowing that the Canadians were burrowing towards them like relentless termites. It was slow, exhausting work. Progress was measured in terrace houses, not miles. But it worked. The farm boys had turned the environment from a liability into an asset. They were no longer fighting in the city. They were fighting through it. This innovation was the turning point. It neutralized the German technological and positional advantage, bringing the fight down to raw grit and close quarters savagery, an arena where the Canadians proved to be terrifyingly skilled. On Christmas Day, amidst this slaughter, a surreal and heartbreaking event took place inside the bombed-out shell of the Church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli. The quartermaster of the Seaforth Highlanders had decided that despite the hell outside, his men would have a Christmas dinner. Inside the church, long tables were set with clean white tablecloths, china plates, and bottles of beer. Luxuries that seemed alien in the dirt of Ortona. An organist played Silent Night and The King, while the sounds of machine gun fire rattled the stained glass windows just meters away. The soldiers ate in shifts. One company would come in covered in mud and blood, eat their roast pork and pudding in a daze, pick up their rifles, and go back out into the killing zone. As one group left the church to return to the fighting, another would enter. Tragically, for many of those young men, it was their last supper. Officers reported that some soldiers who had sat laughing at the table were killed within minutes of walking back out the church doors. It was a fleeting moment of humanity in a world that had gone mad. But the truce of the dinner table did not extend to the streets. By late December, the battle had condensed into a savage struggle for the heart of the town, the Piazza Municipio and the Piazza San Tommaso. The mouse holing tactic had allowed the Canadians to advance, but the closer they got to the town squares, the harder the German resistance became. The Green Devils were cornered, and like cornered animals, they fought with ferocious desperation. A critical element in this phase was the evolution of tank support. In normal urban warfare doctrine, tanks are sitting ducks, but the Three Rivers Regiment, the Regiment de Troyes, Riviere Res, refused to abandon the infantry. They developed a working relationship with the loyal Edmontons and Seaforths that was almost telepathic. The German paratroopers had blocked the narrow side streets with mountains of rubble, assuming this would stop the armor. In response, the Canadian tankers did the unthinkable. They drove their Sherman tanks directly over the debris, tipping dangerously at steep angles, their tracks grinding against the second-story windows of nearby buildings. From these elevated, unstable positions, they fired high explosive shells point blank into German strongpoints across the square. The infantry would spot the targets. The tanks would destroy them. It was a terrifying display of combined arms warfare in a space no larger than a tennis court. However, the violence reached its tragic peak in the War of the Buildings. Realizing they were losing the house, to house fight, the Germans resorted to a tactic of utter ruthlessness. On December 27th, a platoon of the loyal Edmonton Regiment moved into a building they believed had been cleared. Unknown to them, the German engineers had packed the basement with explosives and rigged a delayed fuse. Moments after the Canadians secured the position, the entire building was blown sky high. 23 Canadian soldiers were buried alive in the masonry. It was a devastating blow to the morale of the tight-knit unit. But the farm boys did not break, they got even. In a cold fury, the Canadians identified a similar building nearby that was being used as a staging area for German reinforcements. They hauled explosive charges through their mouse holes, silently planting a massive demolition charge under the cover of a bombardment. When the dust settled from the Canadian detonation, 2 entire German squads, an estimated 40 to 50 paratroopers, were wiped out in a single stroke. This brutal tit-for-tat shocked the German command. They realized the Canadians were willing to match their ruthlessness step for step. The breaking point arrived on the night of December 28th. The battle had raged for 8 days. The German 1st Parachute Division, for all its elite status, was bleeding white. They had lost the element of surprise. Their defensive lines were broken apart by the relentless Canadian tunneling, and they were running low on ammunition. Journalist Matthew Halton, who was near the front lines, reported a sudden, eerie change in the atmosphere. For over a week, the noise had been constant, a wall of sound. But as the morning of December 29th approached, the guns fell silent. Cautiously, the surviving men of the loyal Edmontons and the Seaforths crept forward, expecting another trap. They kicked open doors and found empty rooms. They checked the sniper nests and found only spent shell casings. In the cover of darkness, the invincible paratroopers had slipped away. They left behind a ruined town, hundreds of their dead, and a message scrawled on a wall that begrudgingly acknowledged their enemy. The farm boys had done the impossible. They had not just survived the little Stalingrad, they had conquered it. When the smoke cleared over Ortona, military analysts were left with a burning question. How did a division of volunteers, many of whom had never seen urban combat, defeat the premier fighting force of the Third Reich? The victory was not a stroke of luck. It was the result of specific qualities inherent in the Canadian soldier that the Germans had catastrophically overlooked. The first factor was adaptability. The German military machine was efficient, but it was often rigid. They relied on doctrine. When the battle for Ortona devolved into chaos, the German paratroopers stuck to their defensive training. In contrast, the Canadians, coming from the frontiers of the Commonwealth, possessed a natural cleverness. The farm boy nickname, intended as an insult, was actually their greatest strength. These were men who had spent their lives fixing machinery with wire, navigating harsh terrain, and solving practical problems without supervision. When the street proved deadly, they didn't wait for high command to send a new manual. They invented mouse, holing on the spot. They turned anti-tank weapons into bunker busters. They improvised. They brought a level of practical creativity to the battlefield that the regimented German mind struggled to counter. The second factor was tenacity. The fighting in Ortona was not about grand strategy. It was a test of will. It was a fistfight in a phone booth. The Germans were used to intimidating their opponents with their reputation. But the Canadians, lumberjacks, miners, and prairie farmers, were not easily intimidated. They possessed a quiet, stubborn endurance. They were willing to bleed for every inch of ground, but they refused to stop moving forward. This relentless pressure, day and night, eventually broke the psychological state of the defenders. Furthermore, the unit cohesion of the Canadians was unbreakable. Because the regiments were recruited regionally, these men were not strangers thrown together by a draft. They were fighting alongside their brothers, their cousins, and their childhood friends. You do not retreat when it means leaving your neighbor behind. This bond created a morale that even the fanatical training of the paratroopers could not match. Finally, there was the element of underestimation. The 1st Parachute Division went into the battle believing they were fighting amateurs. By the time they realized they were facing one of the most lethal infantry forces in the Allied coalition, it was too late. The Canadians had already broken through their perimeter and were dismantling their defenses from the inside out. After the battle, a captured German officer reportedly remarked that the Canadians were the only troops in Italy who fought as hard as the Germans. It was a grudging admission of a new reality. The amateurs had graduated. They had met the elite, and they had beaten them at their own game. The silence that fell over Ortona on the morning of December 29th was heavier than the roar of the artillery. The town was a smoking ruin. The beautiful medieval streets had been reduced to jagged piles of brick and mortar, a landscape so unrecognizable that it looked like the surface of another planet. The price of this victory was staggering. During that bloody December, the Canadians suffered over 300 casualties. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders had been decimated, losing many of the original volunteers who had sailed from Canada years before. But in exchange for this blood, they had achieved what many Allied commanders privately thought was impossible. They had driven the invincible 1st Parachute Division out of their fortress. Ortona was more than just a tactical victory. It was a coming-of-age moment for the Canadian military. Before this battle, they were viewed by their larger allies as dependable but unproven colonial troops. After Ortona, that perception evaporated forever. They had proven that they could take the hardest assignment in the theater, a mission that required not just bravery, but immense tactical evolution, and see it through to the bitter end. Today, if you walk the rebuilt streets of Ortona, you will find the Price of Peace monument. It stands as a somber reminder of the violence that once tore through this place. But the true legacy of the battle is not in stone. It is in the reputation of the men who fought there. The world should remember that when the Allies needed to crack the hardest nut on the winter line, they didn't send the American Rangers. They didn't send the British Guards. They sent a group of prairie farmers, lumberjacks, and clerks. And those farm boys, through sheer grit and cleverness, walked into the fire as amateurs and walked out as the undisputed masters of urban warfare. They had beaten the best, and in the process, they had carved their names into history.